In this video, we'll finish the sentences that have complement clauses. Let's go to the next one. John prevented Mary from reading that book. Okay, here, if it were a pronoun, John prevented her from reading that book. So this is subject raised. We won't do anything to the matrix agent. It is subject raised. John prevented her from. Let's say from is a complementizer. From reading that book, we want a participle. John prevented Mary from reading that book. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. Mary waited for John to read that book. Okay, here we won't do anything to the matrix agent NP. If it were a pronoun, Mary waited for her. Mary waited for him to read that book. So that's very tempting to make it subject raised, and we'll go ahead. It's very tempting at first glance to say for is a complementizer. We'll go ahead and do that. Mary waited for him to read that book. We want a to infinitive. But this is going to cause problems, and you'll see why in a minute. Mary waited John for to read that book. So that for isn't a good complementizer. And that was very suspicious anyway. For is a preposition. It belongs up here in this noun phrase. So let's edit that theta grid adjustment rule. Let's take out that complementizer. And instead, let's put the word for into this object noun phrase. And let's change this. When we said it was subject raised, it automatically became a patient and an object. But in this particular case, let's call it an oblique. So, Mary waited for John, this is big pro, to read that book. So this should be proper. Okay, generated text is identical. Mary helped John read that book. If this is a pronoun, Mary helped him read that book. So it is subject raised. Okay, we see that help in our analysis system always takes a patient noun phrase. So even though this is subject raised, we don't need to say that because we already have a patient out here. So simple output, the patient, we won't change it. Mary helped John read that book. There's no complementizer. We won't say subject raised, but we will say big pro. And Mary helped John read that book. This is a bare stem infinitive. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. John heard Mary reading that book. Okay, this sense of hear is to hear an event as it occurs. John heard Mary talking to her friend. If this were a pronoun, John heard her reading that book. So it is subject raised. There's no patient noun phrase out here in the matrix clause, so we do want to say subject raised. There's no complementizer. It is subject raised. John heard Mary reading. We want a participle. John heard Mary reading that book. Generated text is identical. John saw Mary reading that book. So again, it's very similar. To witness an event as it occurs. Mary saw John walking to school. There's no complementizer. John saw her reading that book, so it is subject raised. John saw Mary reading. We want a participle. So-and-so Mary reading that book. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. John caused Mary to want to read that book. So here we have a complement clause, and embedded in this complement clause is another complement clause. And we've already dealt with the theta grid adjustment rules for both cause and want. So hopefully we shouldn't need to do any more work here. John caused Mary to want to read that book. Generated text is identical. John caused Mary to be ready to read that book. So here we have a complement clause, and in this complement clause is an adjective that takes an adjectival complement clause. Now we've already dealt with cause, the theta grid adjustment rule for cause, and we've dealt with the theta grid adjustment rule for ready, so we shouldn't need to do any more work here. John caused Mary to be ready to read that book. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. Peter hopes that Mary told John to read that book. Okay, we haven't yet dealt with the theta grid adjustment rule for hope. So let's do that. Okay, Peter hopes that. So we want a complementizer. Peter hopes that she told John. We don't say Peter hopes that her told John. Peter hopes that she. So it's not subject raised. It's not big pro. That she. Peter hopes that Mary will tell John. This can be fully inflected. Peter hopes that Mary will tell John, or Peter hopes that Mary might tell John. So we won't specify the verb, target, tense, and form. Peter hopes that Mary told John to read that book. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. John read the book that Mary told him to read. Okay, here we have a relative clause, modifying book, and embedded in this relative clause is an object complement clause. We've already dealt with the theta grid adjustment rule for tell, and we've already dealt with relative clauses, so hopefully we won't need to do any more work here. Okay, John read the book that Mary told John to read. We would say that Mary told him to read. And the reason is because John has already occurred in this sentence. So when there's another occurrence of John, we want the pronoun. So let's write a very simple pronoun identification rule. For this video, we're going to keep this very simple. This rule will actually eventually become very complex. But for now, we'll write one just to get us started. Okay. Let's say this is the subject of the sentence, and this is anything other than the subject. We'll leave this unmarked, actually. Let's set the nominal indices. They have to have the same index. And we're going to check ignore clausal embedding and ignore phrasal embedding. So this can be anywhere else in the sentence. Now here, for these pronoun identification rules, they come after the phrase structure rules have been executed. So now order is important. You couldn't say that this one is the subject and then have TBTA find preceding noun phrases. That wouldn't work. This one needs to come first because in English subjects come first. So this noun will be found here, and then if this noun occurs anywhere else in the sentence, ignore clausal embedding, ignore phrasal embedding, and it comes after this noun phrase, then in the output structure we'll set this to a personal pronoun. It's already on. And we're actually going to do a lot of work in this rule later. This is one of the most complicated rules in the system, finding all the nouns that should be converted to pronouns. Let's put it there. Okay, John read the book that Mary told him to read. And if we rest our cursor here, we see features change from surface realization equals noun to personal pronoun by pronoun and switch reference identification rule. Identify all pronouns, rule 1, structure 1. So we'll save that. problem is that John read a book. So here we have a sense of the verb to be that takes a complement clause, equative with object complements. The problem is that, so we want a complementizer. The problem is that he read that book. It's not subject raised. The problem is that he might read that book. The verb is fully inflectional, so we don't need to change anything else here. The problem is that John read that book. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. The secret is that John read a book. So this is the same sense of the verb to be with another complement clause. We've already dealt with this data grid adjustment rule, so I don't think we need to do anything more. Generated text is identical. Let's save it. It pleased Mary that John read that book. So now we're in we call this, if you look at the type, it's an agent clause. In other words, a subject complement. So we'll save this for the next video.